It began in whispers, small gatherings, scattered crowds, muted slogans. The government called them isolated disturbances, the press called them acts of hooliganism, and the people, at least at first, called them nothing at all. Everyone knew what was happening, said a journalist in Nizhny Novgorod, but no one wanted to name it. The protests had started over fuel, then over wages, then over nothing specific at all. It's not about one law or one decision, said a sociologist. It's about exhaustion. For months, the country had lived in suspension, factories idle, salaries unpaid, the government silent. The system didn't collapse, it decayed. And in that silence, something began to grow. At first, the gatherings were peaceful. People stood quietly in front of administrative buildings, holding signs that said "We work, pay us, and we are not enemies." Police watched but didn't intervene. No one wanted to be the first to move, said a local official. It was like a standoff with no sides. But restraint rarely lasts in a system built on fear. When arrests began, they were random: a factory worker here, a student there, a journalist filming too long. It wasn't repression, said the official. It was instinct. Within days, the calm dissolved. The first clashes erupted in Tula. Local police refused to disperse a crowd blocking the highway, claiming they lacked orders. By evening, orders arrived, and were ignored. That's when we realized it wasn't a protest anymore, said a regional correspondent. It was disobedience. In other cities, similar scenes unfolded. In Samara, riot police stood motionless as crowds marched past them. In Kemerovo, protesters seized a fuel depot after rumors spread that the government planned to divert supplies to Moscow. "No one's following anyone," said a witness. "Everyone's just moving." By the end of the week, dozens of towns had fallen into what officials called uncoordinated unrest. But what looked chaotic was, in its own way, organized. Truckers blocked highways, miners seized railways, and factory workers guarded storage sites. "They're protecting what's left of their world," said an economist. When the state stops working, the workplace becomes the nation. Telegram channels once used for local gossip turned into command centers. "They don't call it revolution," said a digital analyst. "They call it logistics." In Moscow, the first emergency session of the Security Council since the oil crisis convened behind closed doors. The language was cautious: containment, dialogue, stability measures. "They still think this is politics," said a participant afterward. "It's not. It's physics." The system had lost mass, and mass was shifting outward, to the regions, the streets, the people. "They're trying to govern a vacuum," he said. The Kremlin's initial response was hesitation. "They're used to managing dissent through isolation," said a senior aide. But this time, isolation doesn't work. Everyone's already isolated. When nationwide communication faltered, regional authorities began issuing their own emergency orders. Some declared curfews, others mobilized local defense units. "That's when it crossed the line," said a Western diplomat. When the word defense entered the vocabulary, protest became conflict. International news agencies picked up the first videos within hours: barricades in Ufa, armored vehicles in Yaroslavl, soldiers in civilian clothes standing at intersections. "It's not full-scale war," said a European security expert. "It's fragmentation in real time." No one claimed leadership, yet the movement spread faster than any government response. "You can't suppress something that doesn't know it exists," he said. Across state media, the tone shifted. Anchors spoke of foreign provocateurs, terrorist cells, agents of destabilization. But the images on social networks told another story: ordinary people, factory workers, pensioners, students. "It's not imported," said a sociologist. "It's homegrown." The footage showed protesters carrying national flags, not opposition banners. "They're not against the country," she added. "They're against its absence." Military units were deployed to ensure public safety, though insiders admitted that coordination between ministries had broken down. "Half the troops don't know who's giving orders," said a defense official. In some areas, soldiers refused to fire, claiming they were protecting civilians. In others, gunfire broke out spontaneously: warning shots, misfires, panic. "It's not a front," said the official. "It's a feedback loop." By nightfall, blackouts spread across the central regions. Officially, they were blamed on technical failures. Unofficially, they were deliberate, an attempt to cut communication. "They think darkness equals control," said a journalist. But people don't need light to be angry. In the absence of information, rumors became fact. Telegram channels filled with reports of armed groups, of defecting officers, of explosions near oil depots. "Half of it's false," said an analyst. "The other half will be true tomorrow." As violence spread, the word civil conflict entered foreign headlines. The Kremlin denied it, calling the reports information warfare. But inside Russia, the distinction no longer mattered. It doesn't have a name yet, said a historian. That's how all internal wars begin, nameless, shapeless, unacknowledged. In the midst of confusion, one message began to appear on walls, social media posts, and printed flyers: "We are still here." "It's not a slogan," said a protester. "It's a reminder. For those who want to understand how a state begins to unravel not from invasion but from inertia, how silence turns into movement and fear into structure, subscribing will keep you close to what happens next, when protest crosses the line into resistance, and resistance starts to sound like survival." By the second week, the unrest had developed its own geography. There was no single front, no single leader, just clusters of resistance spreading like brushfire across the map. "Every city has its own revolution," said a political observer in Kazan. "And none of them look the same." In the south, protesters barricaded highways to block military convoys. In the north, workers occupied factories and turned them into shelters. In the east, railway engineers sabotaged tracks to prevent troop movement. "They're not fighting for power," the observer said. "They're fighting for autonomy, the right to exist outside the silence." The government continued to insist that the situation is under control, though even officials privately admitted they no longer knew what that meant. "Control of what?" asked one regional administrator. "The phones don't work, the ministries don't answer, and no one's been paid in a month." He paused. "I suppose we still control the paperwork." In some areas, local authorities openly negotiated with protesters. "They signed truces like medieval lords," said a historian. Each district becomes its own fortress. In Moscow, the chain of command fractured. Communications between ministries were intermittent, and orders often contradicted one another. "The Interior Ministry tells us to protect civilians," said a police captain in Yaroslavl, "and the Defense Ministry tells us to clear the streets." Which civilians? Which streets? Units began refusing deployments, citing confusion, fatigue, and loyalty to local populations. "It's not mutiny," said a former general. "It's attrition. The hierarchy is dissolving from the bottom up." Reports emerged of officers defecting to protect their hometowns, while others abandoned posts entirely. "They're not changing sides," said the general. "They're choosing proximity." In cities where command broke down, local defense committees formed spontaneously, part police, part militia, part community watch. "They all use the same word," said a journalist. "Protection. But no one can say who they're protecting from whom." State media, unable to maintain coherence, fragmented into regional narratives. Local channels in Siberia broadcast appeals for calm, outlets in the south aired footage of burned checkpoints. "There's no national story anymore," said a media analyst. "Each region is writing its own." The federal networks filled airtime with reruns and patriotic films, their presenters framed by old symbols of stability, flags, maps, slogans, all of which now looked strangely out of time. "They're performing a country that no longer exists," he said. On the ground, the fighting intensified. It was not yet a war, but the pattern had begun. Small groups armed with stolen rifles and homemade explosives clashed with police over fuel depots, train stations, and administrative buildings. "It's not ideology that drives them," said a human rights worker. "It's hunger and memory." In Omsk, a confrontation between factory guards and soldiers left 9 dead. In Bryansk, a local police unit defected and joined the protesters. "It's not rebellion in the political sense," she said. "It's survival in the physical one." As communication lines collapsed, information traveled by rumor. People spoke in fragments, about fires near depots, helicopters over cities, families evacuating on foot. "You never know what's true until it reaches your street," said a resident of Saratov. "And by then, it's too late to check." In many regions, civilians set up roadblocks not to fight, but to control the flow of people and panic. "It's defensive chaos," said a sociologist. "Everyone's building walls, but no one knows where the center is." In the capital, the illusion of order remained, but thinner each day. Soldiers patrolled Red Square, though their uniforms were mismatched. Convoys rolled through empty boulevards, more for display than deterrence. "It's theater for television," said a former Kremlin cameraman. "There's no one left to scare, only viewers left to convince." Even those still loyal to the government admitted privately that the state was operating on stored momentum. "It still moves," said a bureaucrat, "because it hasn't realized it stopped." Foreign governments issued restrained statements calling for peaceful resolution and restoration of stability. "No one wants to intervene," said a diplomat in Brussels. "Everyone remembers what happened the last time Russia changed violently." Behind closed doors, however, contingency plans multiplied, for refugees, for border closures, for nuclear safety. No one says it publicly, the diplomat added, but everyone's preparing for disintegration. Inside Russia, that word was already circulating, quietly, nervously, among those who understood its meaning. It's not secession, said a political scientist. It's evaporation. Each region, each force, each group still used the same flag, the same anthem, the same language, but the unity those symbols represented had dissolved. They don't fight for independence, he said. They fight to define what Russia means when the center disappears. By now, even the protesters no longer identified themselves as one movement. It's grown beyond us, said a former organizer from Ekaterinburg. No one's in charge, and no one's stopping. The revolution, if it could be called that, had lost its politics and found its inertia. It's a storm made of people, he said. You don't lead it, you survive it. And still, every night, in city after city, new crowds appeared, fewer chants, more weapons, less fear. It's not about hope anymore, said a witness in Voronezh. It's about rhythm. Once you start moving, you can't stop. For those who want to follow how a state unravels not through ideology but through exhaustion, how institutions lose gravity and people become their own momentum, subscribing will bring you closer to the moment when a government stops collapsing and begins to vanish. By the third month, no one called it protest anymore. The word had lost meaning. Like currency in hyperinflation, it no longer described the reality on the ground. What began as strikes and marches had hardened into entrenched zones of conflict. It's not organized warfare, said a military analyst in exile. It's decomposition with weapons. The front lines shifted daily, a factory compound one day, a police station the next, a stretch of railway that changed hands 3 times before noon. They're not fighting for territory, he added. They're fighting for continuity, for the right to exist tomorrow. In many regions, army units split in two. Commanders loyal to Moscow received orders that rarely arrived on time, while local officers aligned with civilian committees or simply stopped communicating. It's not defection, said a former colonel. It's gravitational drift. The center no longer pulls. Troops refused transfers, bases operated autonomously, and logistics collapsed under their own contradictions. You can't sustain a military that doesn't know which country it's serving, he said. The Ministry of Defense continued to issue daily statements about strategic stabilization operations. The language was sterile, precise, and almost bureaucratic, an attempt to reassert control through grammar. They're describing civil war as if it's infrastructure maintenance, said a Western diplomat. Maps shown on state television displayed zones of temporary unrest, marked with soft pastel colors that concealed the scale of violence. They're painting over reality, said the diplomat. But the canvas is burning underneath. In the industrial corridor between Nizhny Novgorod and Kazan, fighting broke out between security forces and armed workers who had taken control of transport routes. At first they just guarded supplies, said a journalist. Then they realized guarding becomes control. Across the Urals, military warehouses were looted by unknown groups, and armored vehicles appeared on highways without insignia. It's not rebellion, said a source inside the National Guard. It's disassembly. By now, regions acted as separate actors. Governors issued joint declarations calling for restoration of order through regional coordination. That's code for independence, explained a political scientist. They're replacing the vertical chain with horizontal survival. In practice, this meant local militias answering to local administrations, each claiming to represent national unity while defending only their own cities. It's not fragmentation, he said. It's replication. Every region is becoming a miniature version of the state it no longer trusts. The federal government, confined to Moscow, began to resemble a bunker more than a capital. Electricity was rationed, flights suspended, and public communications filtered through pre-recorded statements. It's an island of authority in a sea of improvisation, said a former Kremlin aide. Advisors debated whether to declare martial law nationwide, though insiders admitted the term no longer applied. You can't impose law where no one recognizes the lawgiver, the aide said. Outside the capital, new symbols emerged. In some cities, local councils raised modified flags, regional emblems with slight variations. They say it's administrative identity, said a sociologist. But every new banner is a quiet declaration, we're on our own now. What unites these enclaves is not ideology, but exhaustion. They don't want to conquer the center, she said. They just want the noise to stop. The violence followed a familiar rhythm. A convoy ambushed. A police unit defecting. A warehouse burned. The next morning, both sides declared victory on local radio. The truth changes with geography, said a war correspondent. 1 kilometer west, you're liberating, 1 kilometer east, you're invading. Civilians learn to read silence as safety. If you hear nothing, said a mother in Samara, it means the fight has moved on, for now. Foreign observers struggled to describe what they were seeing. It's not revolution, not coup, not war, said a European intelligence officer. It's a state evaporating in real time. Satellite images showed convoys of vehicles moving between cities without command, sometimes delivering aid, sometimes weapons. No one knows who funds them anymore, the officer added. That's the hallmark of decay, activity without authorship. In the absence of structure, rumors became authority. Telegram channels claimed entire regions had declared neutrality, while others reported secret negotiations between army factions and governors. None of it's confirmed, said a data analyst. But confirmation doesn't matter anymore. Perception governs reality. Within that fog, figures emerged, former generals, regional mayors, factory leaders, each claiming to represent stability. They're not fighting for ideology, said the analyst. They're fighting for narrative. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation deteriorated. Supply routes collapsed, cities rationed food, and fuel became a currency more valuable than money. You can buy anything with gasoline, said a truck driver. Except peace. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, relied on volunteers to power generators and deliver medicine. It's society replacing the state, said a doctor in Ufa. We don't wait for orders, we improvise survival. Moscow continued to insist that the situation remains manageable. Yet even loyal officials admitted privately that the country had entered a phase no one could reverse. It's not about control anymore, said a minister. It's about maintaining the illusion of it long enough to keep people from realizing it's gone. Outside Russia, governments debated intervention but hesitated. No one wants to inherit this chaos, said a Western diplomat. Everyone wants it to resolve itself, quietly, if possible. Intelligence reports suggested some regional leaders had begun secret talks with neighboring states, negotiating trade and border arrangements. They're not breaking away, said the diplomat. They're preparing for the possibility that the center never comes back. Inside Russia, the war had already lost its language. No one called it civil, patriotic, or defensive anymore. It's just the situation, said a refugee crossing into Kazakhstan. Everyone knows what that means. And somewhere amid the smoke, the slogans faded too. No more we are still here. No more freedom for all. Only silence, punctuated by the rhythm of survival, the sound of a country breaking not in battle, but in repetition. For those who want to follow how wars no longer begin with declarations but with exhaustion, how a state fights itself until even its flags forget their meaning, subscribing will keep you close to the next moment, when the illusion of unity finally burns away, and only fragments remain that still call themselves home. By the time the international community began to react, the war no longer needed a name. It had become a landscape, vast, disordered, and self-sustaining. It's not spreading anymore, said a United Nations observer. It's just existing. Satellite footage showed hundreds of small fires across central Russia, not strategic targets, but fragments of daily life, burning trucks, abandoned depots, ruined towns. It's entropy, said a defense analyst in Brussels. A slow-motion disintegration, too complex to stop and too fragile to fix. The Kremlin, still broadcasting from its heavily fortified compound, insisted that national integrity remains unshaken. But outside Moscow, integrity had turned into geography. Each region now negotiates its own version of peace, said a political scientist. Some with militias, some with the army, some with silence. Governors called their arrangements temporary stabilization zones. It's a euphemism for autonomy, the scientist said. They're managing what the center can no longer see. International aid agencies described the crisis as unprecedented. Supply routes into western Russia were impassable, railways were sabotaged or seized. You can't deliver help into a moving conflict, said a humanitarian coordinator. Entire provinces lived without electricity for weeks. Fuel and medicine were traded like gold, hospitals functioned only where local militias allowed. Every checkpoint is a border, the coordinator said. Every border changes daily. Foreign governments, though alarmed, moved cautiously. There's no one to negotiate with, said a European diplomat. The state exists legally, not physically. Embassies in Moscow remained open but skeletal, operating through satellite phones and private security. The European Union issued statements about deep concern and the need for dialogue, yet none could define who the dialogue should include. When authority fractures, diplomacy collapses with it, the diplomat explained. Neighboring countries closed crossings, fearing refugee waves. By midwinter, hundreds of thousands had fled westward, to Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the Baltic borderlands. Most of them don't even know what they're escaping, said a border official. They just know they can't go back. Camps sprang up along frozen highways, tents lit by generator light, families clutching identification documents that no longer opened any door. We used to talk about sovereignty, said a volunteer medic. Now we talk about heating. Inside Russia, humanitarian corridors existed only on paper. They're announced daily, said a foreign correspondent, but no one can guarantee where they lead. In one town, a convoy of doctors was turned back by armed men calling themselves local defense. In another, school buildings became makeshift hospitals, their windows taped, their roofs patched with sheet metal. It's not the war that kills people, said a doctor in Tver. It's the absence of everything else. The media, once an instrument of control, had collapsed under the weight of contradiction. Federal television kept broadcasting pre-recorded programming, patriotic concerts, cultural retrospectives, speeches about unity, as if the country were still whole. It's like a ghost narrating its own life, said a journalist. Meanwhile, regional channels transmitted on independent frequencies, reporting only what they could confirm within driving distance. Truth has become local, she said. Everything beyond the next city might as well be another world. In the West, analysts debated whether the conflict was still political. It's not revolution or civil war in the classical sense, said a historian. It's a systemic implosion. The Russian Federation remained recognized at the United Nations, still voted on resolutions, still appeared in official communiques. Legally it's alive, said the historian. Practically, it's evaporating. Governments hesitated to acknowledge disintegration, not out of sympathy, but out of fear. No one wants to redraw the map, he added. It's easier to pretend the lines still mean something. Economically, the collapse rippled outward. Energy markets reeled from uncertainty, while global shipping routes shifted to avoid the Black Sea and Baltic corridors. Every price now contains a fraction of Russian risk, said a financial analyst in London. It's the new global tax on instability. Some nations benefited quietly, exporting fuel and grain into the vacuum. The world doesn't pause for sympathy, he said. It adjusts. Back inside the country, survival had replaced ideology. People no longer care who wins, said a teacher in Voronezh. They only care who still has bread. In some regions, former soldiers became mayors, in others, priests organized militias. The lines between governance, faith, and desperation blurred. It's the reappearance of feudal logic, said a sociologist. Every piece of land has its protector, its tax, its silence. Schools reopened sporadically, lessons focused on gardening, first aid, and basic engineering. It's not education, she said. It's training for persistence. International negotiators tried to establish contact with whoever still answered phones. Some spoke to military officers, others to mayors or business figures. Each conversation begins the same way, said a European envoy. We don't speak for the government, but we can deliver calm in our region. That's what the new diplomacy looks like now, calm as currency. Meanwhile, rumors circulated of a new coalition forming, not to reunify the country, but to manage its fragmentation. They're calling it the Union of Stability, said a think tank researcher. But stability, in this context, means mutual exhaustion. The provisional agreements they signed guaranteed trade, not peace. They're building systems without states, he said. Networks replacing nations. From abroad, commentators described the transformation with clinical detachment. It's the first postmodern civil war, wrote one analyst. No sides, no goals, no victory. Just motion. Yet for those living inside it, the abstraction feels cruel. They call it motion, said a nurse in Ryazan. We call it waiting for morning. The world has grown used to the images, frozen roads, flickering fires, silhouettes under falling snow. It's no longer breaking news, admitted a Western correspondent. It's background noise. The war has become invisible by repetition, too long, too shapeless, too constant to remain extraordinary. That's how modern catastrophes survive, she said. By becoming routine. For those who want to follow how conflict turns from crisis into environment, how nations learn to live with their own collapse and the world learns to look away, subscribing will bring you closer to that quiet threshold, where chaos stops shocking and starts settling. By the following spring, the war no longer moved, it hovered. The front lines had dissolved into habits, checkpoints into customs, commanders into caretakers. No one's fighting anymore, said a resident of Saratov. But no one's stopping either. The sound of gunfire became a kind of weather, distant, predictable, ignored. You start noticing silence instead, she said. That's when you realize what peace used to mean. The conflict had matured into permanence, a stable chaos that no longer needed justification or command. It's equilibrium, said a political theorist. A country suspended between existence and memory. What remained of the Russian Federation was a patchwork of autonomies, enclaves, and fictions. Some regions called themselves republics, others simply zones. A few kept the old flag, others designed new ones by rearranging its colors. It's continuity through design, said a sociologist. They're reusing symbols like recycled metal, not for meaning, but for structure. In place of law, there were agreements. In place of government, councils. In place of ideology, exhaustion. They all promise restoration, said the sociologist. But no one defines of what. In Moscow, or what still bore its name, a council of administrators governed only the city itself. They call it the capital, said a journalist, but it's just another region now, larger and lonelier. The old ministries functioned like archives, preserving laws no one enforced and statistics no one trusted. It's governance as heritage, said the journalist. They maintain the image so the memory doesn't collapse completely. In the city squares, people still gathered on national holidays, not out of patriotism but routine. It's choreography without audience, she said. But it keeps the rhythm alive. Across the country, local economies stabilized in their own ways. Fuel was traded for food, labor for safety, silence for electricity. Barter replaced trust, said an economist. And it works better than anyone expected. Farmers formed cooperatives, former engineers built microgrids, old soldiers guarded warehouses in exchange for grain. They've turned the collapse into ecology, he said. Every failure sustains something else. Abroad, analysts stopped calling it conflict and began calling it condition. Russia has entered the chronic phase, wrote one policy report. Not a failed state, but a diffused one. Diplomats referred to post-state governance, meaning no central authority but many functioning fragments. It's like mist, said a European official. You can see it everywhere, but you can't hold it. The United Nations still listed Russia as a member, its seat occupied by whoever Moscow sent that month. They still sign agreements, the official said. But no one expects them to be kept. For the people living inside the fragments, normality returned in small, defiant forms. Markets reopened under new names. Children went to school again, studying history from photocopied books. We tell them about a country that once was, said a teacher in Ekaterinburg. They ask why it ended. I tell them, it didn't end, it just stopped pretending. Churches filled with candles, not for faith, but for light. Belief becomes function when electricity fails, she said. Everything does. The soldiers who remained in service no longer swore loyalty to the state, they swore it to stability. Our orders are simple, said a commander in Tver. Protect the road, protect the people, don't ask who we belong to. He paused, then smiled. Maybe that's the first honest order we've ever had. His men slept in converted schools, shared food with civilians, and enforced curfews few complained about. It's discipline without ideology, he said. That's the only kind that still works. Foreign powers, having grown accustomed to the stalemate, quietly adapted. Trade routes bypassed the chaos, investment flowed elsewhere, and new supply chains grew around the void. The world learned to function without Russia, said an energy analyst. And then stopped noticing it was missing. On international maps, borders remained unchanged, but in diplomatic language, the word Russia appeared less frequently, replaced by the region or the zone. It's erasure by attrition, the analyst said. No one removed it, it just faded. Inside, the fading became culture. Painters depicted abandoned cities as landscapes, musicians sampled radio static, poets wrote elegies to noise. They've turned the collapse into art, said a critic. And art into survival. Communities held festivals to mark the anniversary of the blackout, not in mourning, but as ritual. You can't commemorate something that never ended, said a local organizer. So we celebrate it instead. For the few remaining intellectuals, the transformation became an object of study. It's the first state to survive its own disappearance, said a historian. A ghost that learned to farm, teach, and trade. The irony, he added, is that this fragile equilibrium feels more stable than the old empire ever did. There's no more illusion of control, he said. Only balance. At night, in towns rebuilt from ruin, people gather by the fire and tell stories about the country they once belonged to, a country of borders, parades, factories, and plans. They speak of it the way sailors speak of land, said a traveler. Something solid that existed once, somewhere beyond the horizon. In those stories, Russia lives on, not as government, not as map, but as memories shared across generations. They've turned survival into identity, he said. And that's the closest thing to a nation they have left. Perhaps that's how the modern world ends, not with collapse, but with absorption, not with revolution, but with recollection. 1,000 small systems replacing one enormous one, each carrying a piece of its ghost. History doesn't close chapters anymore, said the historian. It just copies them into smaller books. And so the country remains, everywhere and nowhere, broken but breathing, fragmented but enduring. The sound of its name still carries weight, though the substance behind it has melted into habit. You can't destroy something people keep remembering, he said. You can only let it dissolve. For those who want to follow what happens when nations stop ruling but continue existing, when chaos becomes order and memory becomes government, subscribing will keep you close to that quiet horizon, where collapse finally finds its rhythm and silence begins to sound like survival.